Charles Bronson was a big-screen action hero unlike any other, with the star appearing in classic films like The Magnificent Seven and the Death Wish series over the course of his career. His tough guy image painted him as a guy who wasn't afraid of holding a grudge, and he matched this persona in his day-to-day life. Join Factsverse as we explore how Charles Bronson held his bitter grudges until the very end. Charles Bronson and James Garner didn't get along. The 1963 action war film The Great Escape is generally considered to be one of the best of its kind, specifically from around the time period. It was a starring vehicle for legendary action star Steve McQueen, though it also utilized a stunning ensemble cast. Besides McQueen, the film featured notable performers like Charles Bronson and James Garner. Sadly, Charles and James couldn't get along on set. Their relationship was so poor, James continued telling horror stories about the production for decades. Following Charles's death in the early 2000s, James took the opportunity to speak more about his poor relationship with the late action star than ever before in his autobiography. The book was filled with negative stories about Bronson from around the time of Great Escape's filming. James also allegedly had some issues with Steve McQueen on set, though he and Steve were good friends. James was eventually able to forgive Steve for his egotistical demeanor on set. That merely came from the fact that the actor took the role so seriously. Meanwhile, Charles's egotistical demeanor was a completely different story. While Bronson was no slouch in the industry around the time they were filming, he was no Steve McQueen. But it seems like the actor was acting just as egotistical on the set of the film as the lead was, if not more so. Not only was Charles's demeanor uncalled for, given the fact that he wasn't the film's star, but it also hindered production. It seems his bad attitude during production had little to do with how seriously he took the role, and more with him wanting to be the biggest man on the film's set. Charles Bronson's ego was bigger than Steve McQueen's. According to James Garner, his good friend Steve McQueen may have been a slight nuisance on set, but he was nothing compared to the horror that was Charles Bronson. James said Charles's belligerent behavior lasted throughout the entirety of the shoot. Still, the picture was a huge success. The film followed a group of soldiers trying to escape from a German POW camp during World War II, and it's still considered a classic today. Prior to the feature, Charles Bronson was best known for his appearance in the 1960 Western The Magnificent Seven, while James Garner was best known for his work as the titular character in the hit TV series Maverick. So James was arguably the bigger star between the two when it came time to film The Great Escape. This might have made Charles feel more defensive than otherwise, as it made him the least experienced and least valuable member of The Great Escape's ensemble cast. So he turned his tough guy demeanor up to 11 while working on set. But this didn't make him very popular with his co-stars on the picture. Bronson was a mean man who loved to use and abuse people. In turn, the two would grow to form a grudge against each other over the course of production that lasted for the rest of their lives. Before we tell you more, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to Factsverse if you haven't already. Charles Bronson tried to cheat at poker. One of the horror stories that Garner shared was when the two had become involved in a poker game. This was taking place at James's house shortly after filming was finished. James claimed that during the game, Charles rudely tried to pull one of his bets when it was already too late. If Charles had gotten his way, it would have spelt disaster for another player in the game, who was a young stagehand who was much less wealthy than the film star. James ended up insisting Charles play by the rules and pay out to the young man. Charles was allegedly forced to pay the young man $50, which he rightfully owed to him. But Charles was so mad that James forced him to play by the rules, he exploded. The incident very nearly resulted in Charles and James getting in a fistfight. Because of all these reasons, James Garner never looked at Charles Bronson the same way again. Similarly, Charles held a grudge against James for the remainder of his days. He swore he was never going to work with Garner again and made good on that promise. However, the two did end up running into each other several years later while they were out with their respective wives. James was out with his wife Lois Clark, while Charles was out with his wife Jill Ireland. When the couples ran into each other, they ended up eating dinner together. Lois and Jill got along just fine and had plenty to talk about, but James and Charles had to grit their teeth through the dinner. Following the release of The Great Escape, Charles Bronson went on to achieve greater fame than ever before thanks to his lead role in the 1968 Western Once Upon a Time in the West. The film was directed by Sergio Leone, who had tried to get Charles to play the role in his Dollars trilogy that ended up going to Clint Eastwood many years prior. When The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was filming, Sergio thought of Charles yet again. This time, Sergio tried to get Charles to play the role that went to Lee Van Cleef. Finally, Sergio was able to get Charles to work with him on Once Upon a Time in the West, and the results were incredible. In the 1970s, Charles became a verified Hollywood megastar thanks to 1974's Death Wish. Did Charles Bronson have a death wish? Death Wish starred Charles Bronson in the role of Paul Kersey, who was a man who certainly knew how to hold a grudge. It was a major success and paved the way for a franchise. Charles appeared in a total of 5 Death Wish pictures over the next 2 decades, ending with 1994's Death Wish 5: The Face of Death. While the original film had been a hit with critics and audiences alike, the sequels all received rather dismal reviews. Charles Bronson's authentic tough guy demeanor came as a result of his troubled upbringing. He was one of 15 children born to a poor coal miner, and he was forced to start working in the coal mines himself at a young age. When it came time for him to start school, his family was so poor that he was forced to wear one of his sister's dresses so as not to show up to class naked. This predictably resulted in Charles becoming the laughingstock of his class, which in turn hardened the boy significantly. He was eventually able to leave the coal mines behind for the silver screen, and he never looked back. He met his wife, Jill Ireland, during the filming of The Great Escape. At the time, she was married to actor David McCallum, who also had a supporting role in the film. Legend has it that Charles turned to McCallum during filming and told him point blank he intended to marry the man's wife. Charles ended up stealing Jill away from the man, and Charles and Jill remained married until Jill's death in 1990. Now it's time to hear from you. Which part of the story was most surprising to hear about? Let us know in the comments section below. And before you go, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to Factsverse if you haven't already. Click the bell icon to stay updated on all our latest content. By the way, if you haven't joined Factsverse as a member yet, be sure to look below this video and click the join button. By becoming a paid member of Factsverse, you'll get access to exclusive video content that you won't find anywhere else. This includes some of our more mature content that isn't suitable for public audiences, which includes topics like Hollywood actresses who posed for Playboy and some of the steamiest moments in movie history. Plus, you can enjoy these videos completely ad-free. Our biggest fans will notice they also get badges next to their name when they leave comments on our videos. We pay special attention to comments from our members, and so do other viewers. So if you want exclusive content from Factsverse or inside access to discussions with other community members, click the join button to get started for just $4.99. There are hours of members-only videos waiting for you, with new videos added every month. And we're actively working on bringing even more features to help fans like you connect with other members and get more of your favorite content. Just click join, and we'll see you inside the membership tab.